Chapter 15 of Jimbo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimbo by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 15. The Call of the Body. One night, towards the end of the practice flights, a strange thing happened which showed that the time for the final flight of escape was drawing near. They had been out for several hours flying through a rainstorm, the 1,000 little drops of which stung their faces like tiny gunshot. About 2 a.m. the wind shifted and drove the clouds away as by magic. The stars came out, at first like the eyes of children, still dim with crying, but later with a clear brilliance that filled Jimbo and the governess with keen pleasure. The air was washed and perfumed, the night luminous, alive, and singing. All its tenderness and passion entered their hearts and filled them with the wonder of its glory. "Come on, Jimbo," said the governess, "and we'll lie in the trees and smell the air after the rain." "Yes," added the boy, whose older self had been leading him far down the gallery of memories, "and watch the stars and hear them singing." She led the way to some beech trees that lined a secluded lane, and he settled himself comfortably in the top branches of the largest, while the governess soon found a resting place beside him. It was a deserted spot, far from human habitation. Here and there through the foliage they could see little pools of rainwater reflecting the sky. The group of trees swung in the wind, dreaming great woodland dreams, and overhead the stars looked like 1,000 orchards in the sky, filling the air with the radiance of their blossoms. "How brilliant they are tonight," said the governess, after watching the boy keenly for some minutes as they lay side by side in the great forked branch. "I never saw the constellations so clear." "But they have so little shape," he answered dreamily. "If we wore lights when we flew about, we should make much better constellations than they do." "The big and little child instead of the big and little bear," she laughed, still watching him. "I'm slipping away," he began suddenly, and then stopped. He saw the expression of his companion's eyes, which were looking him through and through with the most poignant love and yearning mingled in their gaze, and something clutched at his heart that he could not understand. "Not slipping out of the tree," he went on vaguely, "but slipping into some new place or condition. I don't understand it. Am I going off somewhere where you can't follow? I thought suddenly I was losing you." The governess smiled at him sadly and said nothing. She stroked his wings and then raised them to her lips and kissed them. Jimbo watched her and folded his other wing across into her hands. He felt unhappy, and his heart began to swell within him, and he didn't know what to say, and the older self began slowly to fade away again. "But the stars," he went on, "have they got things they send out too? Forces, I mean, like the trees? Do they send out something that makes us feel sad or happy or strong or weak?" She did not answer for some time. She lay watching his face and fondling his smooth red wings, and presently, when she did begin to explain, Jimbo found that the child in him was then paramount again, and he could not quite follow what she said. He tried to answer properly and seem interested, but her words were very long and hard to understand, and after a time he thought she was talking to herself more than to him, and he gave up all serious effort to follow. Then he became aware that her voice had changed. The words seemed to drop down upon him from a great height. He imagined she was standing on one of those far stars he had been asking about, and was shouting at him through an immense tube of sky and darkness. The words pricked his ears like needle points, only he no longer heard them as words, but as tiny explosions of sound, meaningless and distant. Swift flashes of light began to dance before his eyes, and suddenly from underneath a tree a wind rose up and rushed, laughing, across his face. Darkness in a mass dropped over his eyes, and he sank backwards somewhere into another corner of space altogether. The governess, meanwhile, lay quite still, watching the limp form in the branches beside her, and still holding the tips of his red wings. Presently tears stole into her eyes and began to run down her cheeks. One deep sigh after another escaped from her lips, but the little boy, or the old soul, who was the cause of all her emotion, apparently was far away and knew nothing of it. For a long time she lay in silence, and then leaned a little nearer to him, so as to see his full face. The eyes were wide open and staring, but they were looking at nothing she could see, for the consciousness cannot be in two places at the same time, and Jimbo just then was off in a little journey of his own, a journey that was but preliminary to the great final one of all. "Jimbo," whispered the girl between her tears and sighs, "Jimbo, where have you gone to? Tell me, are they getting ready for you at last, and am I to lose you after all? Is this the only way I can save you, by losing you?" There was no answer, no sign of movement, and the governess hid her face in her hands and cried quietly to herself, while her tears dropped down through the branches of the tree and fell into rain pools beneath. For Jimbo's state of oblivion in the tree was in reality a momentary return to consciousness in his body on the bed, and the repaired mechanism of the brain and muscles had summoned him back on a sort of trial visit. He remembered nothing of it afterwards, any more than one remembers the experiences of deep sleep. But the fact was that, with the descent of the darkness upon him in the branches, he had opened his eyes once again on the scene in the night nursery bedroom where his body lay. He saw figures standing round the bed and about the room. His mother, with the same white face as before, was still bending over the bed, asking him if he knew her. A tall man in a long black coat moved noiselessly to and fro, and he saw a shaded lamp on a table a little to the right of the bed. Nothing seemed to have changed very much, though there had probably been time enough since he had last opened his eyes for the black-coated doctor to have gone and come again for a second visit. He held an instrument in his hands that shone brightly in the lamplight. Jimbo saw this plainly, and wondered what it was. He felt as if he was just waking up of a nice deep sleep, dreamless and undisturbed. The empty house, the governess, fright, and the children had all vanished from his memory, and he knew no more about wings and feathers than he did about the science of meteorology. But the bedroom scene was a mere glimpse after all. His eyes were already beginning to close again. First they shut out the figure of the doctor, then the bed curtains, and then the nurse moved her arm, making the whole scene quiver for an instant, like some huge jelly shape, before it dipped into profound darkness and disappeared altogether. His mother's voice ran off into a thin trickle of sound, miles and miles away, and the light from the lamp followed him with its glare for less than half a second. All had vanished. "Jimbo, dear, where have you been? Can you remember anything?" asked the soft voice beside him, as he looked first at the stars overhead, and then from the tracery of branches and leaves beneath him to the great sea of tree-tops and open country all around. But he could tell her nothing. He seemed dreamy and absent-minded, lying and staring at her as if he hardly knew who she was or what she was saying. His mind was still hovering near the border-line of the two states of consciousness, like the region between sleeping and waking, where both worlds seem unreal and wholly wonderful. He could not answer her questions, but he evidently caught some reflex in her emotions, for he leaned towards her across the branches and said he was happy and never wanted to leave her. Then he crawled to the edge of the big bough and sprang out into the air with a shout of delight. He was the child again, the flying child, wild with the excitement of tearing through the night air at 50 miles an hour. The governess soon followed him, and they flew home together, taking a long turn by the sea and past the great chalk cliffs, where the sea sang loud beneath them. These lapses became with time more frequent, as well as of longer duration, and with them the boy noticed that the longing to escape became once again intense. He wanted to get home, wherever home was. He experienced a sort of nostalgia for the body, though he could not remember where that body lay. But when he asked the governess what this feeling meant, she only mystified him by her answers, saying that everyone, in the body or out of it, felt a deep longing for their final home, though they might not have the least idea where it lay, or even to be able to recognize, much less label, their longing. His normal feelings, too, were slowly returning to him. The older self became more and more submerged. As he approached the state of ordinary superficial consciousness, the characteristics of that state reflected themselves more and more in his thoughts and feelings. His memory still remained a complete blank, but he somehow felt that the things, places and people he wanted to remember had moved much nearer to him than before. Every day brought them more and more within his reach. "All these forgotten things will come back to me soon, I know," he said one day to the governess, "and then I'll tell you all about them." "Perhaps you'll remember me too then," she answered, a shadow passing across her face. Jimbo clapped his hands with delight. "Oh," he cried, "I should like to remember you, because that would make you a sort of two-people governess, and I should love you twice as much." But with the gradual return to former conditions, the feelings of age and experience grew dim and indefinite. His knowledge lessened, becoming obscure and confused, showing itself only in vague impressions and impulses, until at last it became quite the exception for the child consciousness to be broken through by flashes of intuition and inspiration from the more deeply hidden memories. For one thing, the deep horror of the empty house and its owner now returned to him with full force. Fear settled down again over the room, and lurked in the shadows over the yard. A vivid dread seized him of the other door in the room, the door through which the frightened children had disappeared, and which had never opened since. It gradually became for him a personality in the room, a staring, silent, listening thing, always watching, always waiting. One day it would open, and he would be caught. In a dozen ways like this the horrors of the house entered his heart and made him long for escape with all the force of his being. But the governess too seemed changing. She was becoming more vague and more mysterious. Her face was always sad now, and her eyes wistful. Her manner became restless and uneasy, and in many little ways the child could not fail to notice that her mind was intent upon other things. He begged her to name the day of the final flight, but she always seemed to have some good excuse for putting it off. "I feel frightened when you don't tell me what's going on," he said to her. "It's the preparations for the last flight," she answered. "The flight of escape. He'll try to prevent us going together, so that you should get lost. But it's better you shouldn't know too much," she added. "Trust me and have patience." "Oh, that's what you're so afraid of," he said. "Separation." He was very proud indeed of the long word, and said it over several times to himself. And the governess, looking out of the window at the fading sunlight, repeated to herself more than to him the word he was so proud of. "Yes, that's what I'm so afraid of. Separation. But if it means your salvation—" And her sentence remained unfinished as her eyes wandered far above the tops of the trees into the shadows of the sky. And Jimbo, drawn by the sadness of her voice, turned towards the window and noticed, to his utter amazement, that he could see right through her. He could see the branches of the trees through her body. But the next instant she turned and was no longer transparent, and before the boy could say a word she crossed the room and disappeared downstairs through the trapdoor. End of chapter 15. Of Jimbo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimbo by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 16. Preparation. Now that he was preparing to leave it, Jimbo began to realize more fully how things in this world of delirium, so the governess sometimes called it, were all terribly out of order and confused. So long as he was wholly in it and of it, everything had seemed all right, but as he approached his normal condition again, the disorder became more and more apparent, and the next few hours brought it home with startling clearness, and increased the desire for the final escape to fever heat. It was not so much a nonsense world, it was too alarming for that, as a world of nightmare, wherein everything was distorted. Events in it were all out of proportion. Effects no longer sprang from adequate causes. Things happened in a dislocated sort of way, and there was no sequence in the order of their happening. Tiny occurrences filled him with disproportionate, inconceivable horror, and great events, on the other hand, passed him scatheless. The spirit of disorder, monstrous, uncouth, terrifying, reigned supreme, and Jimbo's whole desire, though inarticulate, was to escape back into order and harmony again. In contrast to all this dreadful uncertainty, the conduct of the governess stood out alone as the one thing he could count on. She was sure and unfailing. He felt absolute confidence in her plans for his safety, and when he thought of her his mind was at rest. Come what might, she would always be there in time to help. The adventure over the sea had proved that, but, childlike, he thought chiefly of his own safety, and had ceased to care very much whether she escaped with him or not. It was the older Jimbo that preferred captivity to escape without her, whereas every minute now he was sinking deeper into the normal child state in which the intuitive flashes from the buried soul became more and more rare. Meanwhile there was preparation going on, secret and mysterious. He could feel it. Someone else beside the governess was making plans, and the boy began to dread the moment of escape almost as much as he desired it. The alternative appalled him. To live for ever in the horror of this house, bounded by the narrow yard, watched by fright, listening ever at his elbow, and visited by the horrible frightened children. Even the governess herself began to inspire him with something akin to fear, as her personality grew more and more mysterious. He thought of her as she stood by the window, with the branches of the tree visible through her body, and the thought filled him with a dreadful and haunting distress. But this was only when she was absent. The moment she came into the room and he looked into her kind eyes, the old feeling of security returned, and he felt safe and happy. Once, during the day, she came up to see him, and this time with final instructions. Jimbo listened with rapt attention. "Tonight or tomorrow night we start," she said in a quiet voice. "You must wait till you hear me calling." "But shan't we start together?" he interrupted. "Not exactly," she replied. "I'm doing everything possible to put him off the scent, but it's not easy, for once fright knows you, he's always on the watch. Even if he can't prevent your escape, he'll try to send you home to your body with such a shock that you'll be only half there for the rest of your life." Jimbo did not quite understand what she meant by this, and returned at once to the main point. "Then the moment you call I'm to start?" "Yes. I shall be outside somewhere. It depends on the wind and the weather a little, but probably I shall be hovering above the trees. You must dash out of the window and join me the moment you hear me call. Clear the wall without sinking into the yard, and mind he doesn't tear your wings off as you fly by." "What will happen, though, if I don't find you?" he asked. "You might get lost. If he succeeds in getting me out of the way first, you're sure to get lost." "But I've had long flights without getting lost," he objected. "Nothing to this one," she replied. "It will be tremendous. You see, Jimbo, it's not only distance, it's change of condition as well." "I don't mind what it is, so long as we escape together," he said, puzzled by her words. He kept his eyes fixed on her face. It seemed to him she was changing even as he looked at her, a sort of veil lifted from her features. He fancied he could see the shape of the door through her body. "Oh, please, Miss Lake," he began in a frightened voice, taking a step towards her. "What is the matter? You look so different." "Nothing, dear boy, is the matter," she replied faintly. "I feel sad at the thought of our going, that's all. But that's nothing," she added more briskly. "And remember, I've told you exactly what to do, so you can't make any mistake. Now, goodbye for the present." There was a smile on her face that he had never seen there before, and an expression of tenderness and love that even he could not fail to understand. But even as he looked, she seemed to fade away into a delicate thin shadow as she moved slowly towards the trap door. Jimbo stretched out his arms to touch her, for the moment of dread had passed, and he wanted to kiss her. "No," she cried sharply. "Don't touch me, child, don't touch me." But he was already close beside her, and in another second would have had his arms round her, when his foot stumbled over something, and he fell forward into her with his full weight. Instead of saving himself against her body, however, he fell clean through her. Nothing stopped him. he met nothing more solid than air, and fell full length onto the floor. Before he could recover from his surprise and pick himself up, something touched him on the lips, and he heard a voice that was faint as a whisper, saying, "Goodbye, darling child, and bless you." The next moment he was on his feet again, and the room was empty. The governess had gone through the trap-door, and he was alone. It was all very strange and confusing, and he could not understand what was happening to her. He never for a moment realized that the change was in himself, and that as the tie between himself and his body became closer, the things of this other world he had been living in for so long must fade gradually away into shadows and emptiness. But Jimbo was a brave boy, and there was nothing of the coward in him, though his sensitive temperament made him sometimes hesitate where an ordinary child with less imagination would have acted promptly. The desire to cry he thrust down and repressed, fighting his depression by the thought that within a few hours the voice might sound that should call him to the excitement of the last flight and freedom. The rest of the daylight slipped away very quickly, and the room was full of shadows almost before he knew it. Then came the darkness. Outside the wind rose and fell fitfully, booming in the chimney with hollow music, and sighing round the walls of the house. A few stars peeped between the branches of the elms, but masses of cloud hid most of the sky, and the air felt heavy with coming rain. He lay down on the bed and waited. At the least sound he started, thinking it might be the call from the governess. But the few sounds he did hear always resolved themselves into the moaning of the wind, and no voice came. With his eyes on the open window, trying to pierce the gloom and find the stars, he lay motionless for hours, while the night wore on and the shadows deepened. And during those long hours of darkness and silence he was conscious that a change was going on within him. Name it he could not, but somehow it made him feel that living people like himself were standing near him, trying to speak, beckoning, anxious to bring him into their own particular world. The darkness was so great that he could see only the square outline of the open window, but he felt sure that any sudden flash of light would have revealed a group of persons round his bed, with arms outstretched, trying to reach him. The emotion they roused in him was not fear, for he felt sure they were kind and eager only to help him, and the more he realized their presence, the less he thought about the governess, who had been doing so much to make his escape possible. Then, too, voices began to sound somewhere in the air, and he could not tell whether they were actually in the room, or outside in the night, or even within himself, in his own head. Strange, faint voices, whispering, laughing, shouting, crying. Fragments of stories, rhymes, riddles, odd names of people and places jostled one another with varying degrees of clearness, now loud, now soft, till he wondered what it all meant, and longed for the light to come. And besides all this, something else too was abroad that night, something he could not name, or even think about without shaking with terror down to the very roots of his being. And when he thought of this, his heart called loudly for the governess, and the people hidden in the shadows of the room seemed quite useless and unable to help. Thus he hovered between the two worlds and the two memories, phantoms and realities shifting and changing places every few minutes. A little light would have saved him much suffering. If only the moon were up! Moonlight would have made all the difference. Even a moon half hidden would have put the shadows farther away from him. "Dear old misty moon," he cried half aloud to himself on the bed, "why aren't you here tonight, my last night?" Misty moon, misty moon. The words kept ringing in his ear. Misty moon, misty moon. They swam around in his blood in an odd tumultuous rhythm. Every time the current of blood passed through his brain in the course of its circulation, it brought the words with it, altered a little, and singing like a voice. Like a voice! Suddenly he made a discovery that it actually was a voice, and not his own. It was no longer the blood singing in his veins, it was someone singing outside the window. The sound began faintly and far away, up above the trees. Then it came gradually nearer, only to die away again, almost to a whisper. If it was not the voice of the governess, he could only say it was a very good imitation of it. The words forming out of the empty air rose and fell with the wind, and taking his thoughts flung them in a stream through the dark sky towards the hidden misty moon. "O misty moon, dear misty moon, the nights are long without thee. The shadows creep across my sleep and fold their wings about me." And another silvery voice, that might have been the voice of a star, took it up faintly, evidently from a much greater distance. "O misty moon, sweet misty moon, the stars are dim behind thee, and lo, thy beams swing through my dreams and weave a veil to blind me." The sound of this beautiful voice so delighted Jimbo that he sprang from his bed and rushed to the window, hoping that he might be able to hear it more clearly. But before he got halfway across the room he stopped short, trembling with terror. Underneath his very feet, in the depths of the house, he heard the awful voice he dreaded more than anything else. It roared out the lines with a sound like the rushing of a great river. "O misty moon, pale misty moon, thy songs are nightly driven eternally from sky to sky, o'er the old grey hills of heaven." And after the voice Jimbo heard a great peal of laughter that seemed to shake the walls of the house and rooted his feet to the floor. It rolled away with thundering echoes into the very bowels of the earth. He just managed to crawl back to his mattress and lie down, when another voice took up the song, but this time in accents so tender that the child felt something within him melt into tears of joy, and he was on the verge of recognizing, for the first time since his accident, the voice of his mother. "O misty moon, shy misty moon, whence comes the blush that trembles in sweet disgrace o'er half thy face, when night her stars assembles?" But his memory, of course, failed him just as he seemed about to grasp it, and he was left wondering why the sound of that one voice had brought him a moment of radiant happiness in the midst of so much horror and pain. Meanwhile the answering voices went on, each time different, and in new directions. But the next verse somehow brought back to him all the terror he had felt in his flight over the sea, when the sound of the hissing waters had reached his ear through the carpet of fog. "O misty moon, persuasive moon, earth's tides are ever rising. By the awful grace of thy weird white face, leap the seas to thy enticing." Then followed the voice that had started the horrid song. This time he was sure it was not Miss Lake's voice, but only a very clever imitation of it. Moreover, it again ended in a shriek of laughter that froze his blood. "O misty moon, deceiving moon, thy silvery glance brings sadness. Who flies to thee from land or sea shall end his days in madness." Other voices began to laugh and sing, but Jimbo stopped his ears, for he simply could not bear any more. He felt certain, too, that these strange words to the moon had all been part of a trap, a device to draw him to the window. He shuddered to think how nearly he had fallen into it, and determined to lie on the bed and wait till he heard his companion calling, and knew beyond all doubt that it was she. But the night passed away, and the dawn came, and no voice had called him forth to the last flight. Hitherto in all his experiences there had been only one absolute certainty, the appearance of the governess with the morning light. But this time sunrise came, and the clouds cleared away, and the sweet smells of field and air stole into the little room, yet without any sign of the governess. The hours passed, and she did not come, till finally he realized she was not coming at all, and he would have to spend the whole day alone. Something had happened to prevent her, or else it was all part of her mysterious plan. He did not know, and all he could do was to wait, and wonder, and hope. All day he lay and waited, and all day long he was alone. The trapdoor never once moved. The courtyard remained empty and deserted. There was no sound on the landing or on the stairs. No wind stirred the leaves outside, and the hot sun poured down out of a cloudless sky. He stood by the open window for hours watching the motionless branches. Everything seemed dead. Not even a bird crossed his field of vision. The loneliness, the awful silence, and above all the dread of the approaching night was sometimes more than he seemed to be able to bear, and he wanted to put his head out of the window and scream, or lie down on the bed and cry his heart out. But he yielded to neither impulse. He kept a brave heart, knowing that this would be his last night in prison, and that in a few hours' time he would hear his name called out of the sky, and would dash through the window to liberty and the last wild flight. This thought gave him courage, and he kept all his energy for the great effort. Gradually once more the sunlight faded, and the darkness began to creep over the land. Never before had the shadows under the elms looked so fantastic, nor the bushes in the field beyond assumed such sinister shapes. The empty house was being gradually invested. The enemy was masquerading already under the cover of these very shadows. Very soon, he felt, the attack would begin, and he must be ready to act. The night came down at last with a strange suddenness, and with it the warning of the governess came back to him, and he thought quakingly of the stricken children who had been caught and deprived of their wings. And then he pulled out his long red feathers and tried their strength, and gained thus fresh confidence in their power to save him when the time came. End of chapter 16. Of Jimbo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimbo by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 17. Off. With the full darkness, a whole army of horrors crept nearer. He felt sure of this, though he could actually see nothing. The house was surrounded, the courtyard crowded. Outside on the stairs, in the other rooms, even on the roof itself, waited dreadful things ready to catch him, to tear off his wings, to make him prisoner for ever and ever. The possibility that something had happened to the governess now became a probability. Imperceptibly the change was wrought. He could not say how or when exactly, but he now felt almost certain that the effort to keep her out of the way had succeeded. If this were true, the boy's only hope lay in his wings, and he pulled them out to their full length and kissed them passionately, speaking to the strong red feathers as if they were living little persons. "You must save me! You will save me, won't you?" he cried in his anguish. And every time he did this and looked at them, he gained fresh hope and courage. The problem where he was going to fly to had not yet insisted on a solution, though it lay always at the back of his mind, for the final flight of escape without a guide had never been even a possibility before. Lying there alone in the darkness, waiting for the sound of the voice so longed for, he found his thoughts turning again to the moon and the strange words of the song that had puzzled him the night before. What in the world did it all mean? Why all this about the moon? Why was it a cruel moon? And why should it attract and persuade and entice him? He felt sure, the more he thought of it, that this had all been a device to draw him to the window, and perhaps even farther. The darkness began to terrify him. He dreaded more and more the waiting, listening things that it concealed. Oh, when would the governess call to him? When would he be able to dash through the open window and join her in the sky? He thought of the sunlight that had flooded the yard all day, so bright it seemed to have come from a sun fresh made and shining for the first time. He thought of the exquisite flowers that grew in the fields just beyond the high wall, and the night smells of the earth reached him through the window, wafted in upon a heavy wind, with secrets of woods and fields. They all came from a land of magic that after tonight might be forever beyond his reach, and they went straight to his heart and immediately turned something solid there into tears. But the tears did not find their natural expression, and Jimbo lay there fighting with his pain, keeping all his strength for the one great effort, and waiting for the voice that at any minute now might sound above the tree-tops. But the hours passed, and the voice did not come. How he loathed the room and everything in it! The ceiling stretched like a white staring countenance above him, the walls watched and listened, and even the mantelpiece grew into the semblance of a creature with drawn-up shoulders bending over him. The whole room, indeed, seemed to his frightened soul to run into the shape of a monstrous person whose arms were outstretched in all directions to prevent his escape. His hands never left his wings now. He stroked and fondled them, arranging the feathers smoothly and speaking to them under his breath, just as though they were living things. To him they were indeed alive, and he knew when the time came they would not fail him. The fierce passion for the open spaces took possession of his soul, and his whole being began to cry out for freedom, rushing wind, the stars, and a pathless sky. Slowly the power of the great open night entered his heart, bringing with it a courage that enabled him to keep the terrors of the house at a distance. So far the boy's strength had been equal to the task, but a moment was approaching when the tension would be too great to bear, and the long pent-up force would rush forth into an act. Jimbo realized this quite clearly, Though he could not exactly express it in words, he felt that his real hope of escape lay in the success of that act. Meanwhile, with more than a child's wisdom, he stored up every particle of strength he had for the great moment when it should come. A light wind had risen soon after sunset, but as the night wore on it began to fail, dropping away into little silences that grew each time longer. In the heart of one of these spells of silence Jimbo presently noticed a new sound, a sound that he recognized. Far away at first, but growing in distinctness with every dropping of the wind, this new sound rose from the interior of the house below and came gradually upon him. It was voices faintly singing, and the tread of stealthy footsteps. Nearer and nearer came the sound, till at length they reached the door, and there passed into the room a wave of fine, gentle sound that woke no echo, and scarcely seemed to stir the air into vibration at all. The door had opened, and a number of voices were singing softly under their breath. And after the sounds, creeping slowly like some timid animal, there came into the room a small black figure, just visible in the faint starlight. It peered round the edge of the door, hesitated a moment, then advanced with an odd rhythmical sort of motion. And after the first figure came a second, and after the second a third, and then several entered together, until a whole group of them stood on the floor between Jimbo and the open window. Then he recognized the frightened children, and his heart sank. Even they, he saw, were arrayed against him, and took it for granted that he already belonged to them. Oh, why did not the governess come for him? Why was there no voice in the sky? He glanced with longing towards the heavens, and as the children moved past, he was almost certain he saw the stars through their bodies too. Slowly they shuffled across the floor till they formed a semicircle round the bed, and then they began a silent, impish dance that made the flesh creep. Their thin forms were dressed in black gowns like shrouds, and as they moved through the steps of this bizarre dance he saw that their legs were little more than mere skin and bone. Their faces, what he could see of them when he dared to open his eyes, were pale as ashes, and their beady little eyes shone like the facets of cut stones, flashing in all directions. And while they danced in and out amongst each other, never breaking the semicircle round the bed, they sang a low mournful song that sounded like the wind whispering through a leafless wood, and the words stirred in him that vague yet terrible fear known to all children who have been frightened and made to feel afraid of the dark. Evidently his sensations were being merged very rapidly now into those of the little boy in the night nursery bed. There is someone in the nursery whom we never saw before. Why hangs the moon so red? And he came not by the passage, or the window, or the door. Why hangs the moon so red? And he stands there in the darkness, in the centre of the floor. See where the moon hangs red. Someone's hiding in the passage where the door begins to swing. Why drive the clouds so fast? In the corner by the staircase there's a dreadful waiting thing. Why drive the clouds so fast? Past the curtain creeps a monster with a black and fluttering wing. See where the clouds drive fast. In the chilly dusk of evening, in the hush before the dawn, why drips the rain so cold? In the twilight of the garden, in the mist upon the lawn, why drips the rain so cold? Faces stare and mouth upon us, faces white and weird and drawn. See how the rain drips cold. close beside us in the night time, waiting for us in the gloom. Oh, why sings the wind so shrill? In the shadows by the cupboard, in the corners of the room. Oh, why sings the wind so shrill? From the corridors and landings voices call us to our doom. Oh, how the wind sings shrill! By this time the dreadful dancers had come much closer to him, shifting stealthily nearer to the bed under cover of their dancing, and always between him and the window. Suddenly their intention flashed upon him. They meant to prevent his escape. With a tremendous effort he sprang from the bed. As he did so, a dozen pairs of thin, shadowy arms shot out towards him as though to seize his wings. But with an agility born of fright he dodged them and ran swiftly into the corner by the mantelpiece. Standing with his back against the wall, he faced the brutal children and strove to call out for help to the governess. But this time there was an entirely new difficulty in the way, for he found, to his utter dismay, that his voice refused to make itself heard. His mouth was dry, and his tongue would hardly stir. Not a sound issued from his lips, but the children instantly moved forwards and hemmed him in between them and the wall, and to reach the window he would have to break through this semicircle of whispering, shadowy forms. Above their heads he could see the stars shining, and any moment he might hear Miss Lake's voice calling to him to come out. His heart rose with passionate longing within him, and he gathered his wings tightly about him, ready for the final dash. It would take more than the frightened children to hold him a prisoner when once he heard that voice, or even without it. Whether they were astonished at his boldness, or merely waiting their opportunity later, he could not tell. But anyhow they kept their distance for a time, and made no further attempt to seize his feathers. Whispering together under their breath, sometimes singing their mournful, sighing songs, sometimes sinking their voices into a confused murmur, they moved in and out amongst each other with soundless feet, like the shadows of branches swaying in the wind. Then, suddenly, they moved closer and stretched out their arms towards him, their bodies swaying rhythmically together, while their combined voices, raised just above a whisper, sang to him, "Dare you fly out tonight, when the moon is so strong? Though the stars are so bright, there is death in their song. You're a hostage to fright, and to us you belong. Dare you fly out alone through the shadows that wave, when the course is unknown, and there's no one to save? You are bone of our bone, and for ever his slave." And, following these words, came from somewhere in the air outside that much more dreaded voice, like the thunder of a river. Jimbo knew only too well to whom it belonged, as he listened to the rhyme of the west wind. "For the wind of the west is a wind unblessed, and its dangerous breath will entice you to death. Fly not with the wind of the west, O child, with the terrible wind of the west." But Jimbo knew perfectly well that these efforts to stop him were all part of a trap. They were lying to him. It was not the wind of the west at all. It was the south wind. That at least he knew by the odours that were wafted in through the window. Again he tried to call the governess, but his tongue lay stiff in his mouth, and no sound came. Meanwhile the children began to draw closer, hemming him in. They moved almost imperceptibly, but he saw plainly that the circle was growing smaller and smaller. His legs began to tremble, and he felt that soon he would collapse and drop at their feet, for his strength was failing, and the power to act and move was slowly leaving him. The little shadowy figures were almost touching him, when suddenly a new sound broke the stillness and set every nerve tingling in his body. Something was shuffling along the landing. He heard it outside, pushing against the door. The handle turned with a rattle, and a moment later the door slowly opened. For a second Jimbo's breath failed him, and he nearly fell in a heap upon the floor. Round the edge of the door he saw a dim, huge figure come crawling into the room, creeping along the floor, and trailing behind it a pair of immense black wings that stretched along the boards. For one brief second he stared, horror-stricken, and wondering what it was, but before the whole length of the creature was in, he knew it was Fright himself, and he was making steadily for the window. The shock instantly galvanized the boy into a state of activity again. He recovered the use of all his muscles and all his faculties. His voice, released by terror, rang out in a wild shriek for help to the governess, and he dashed forward across the room in a mad rush for the window. Unless he could reach it before the other, he knew he would be a prisoner for the rest of his life. It was now or never. The instant he moved, the children came straight at him with hands outstretched to stop him, but he passed through them as if they were smoke, and with almost a single bound sprang upon the narrow window-sill. To do this he had to clear the head and shoulders of the creature on the floor, and though he accomplished it successfully, he felt himself clutched from behind. For a second he balanced doubtfully on the window ledge. He felt himself being pulled back into the room, and he combined all his forces into one tremendous effort to rush forward. There was a ripping, tearing sound as he sprang into the air with a yell of mingled terror and exultation. His prompt action and the fierce impetus had saved him. He was free. But in the awful hand that seized him he had left behind the end feathers of his right wing. A few inches more, and it would have been not merely the feathers, but the entire wing itself. He dropped to within 3 feet of the stones in the yard, and then, borne aloft by the kind rushing wind of the south, he rose in a tremendous sweep far over the tops of the high elms and out into the heart of the night. Only there was no governess's voice to guide him, and behind him, a little lower down, a black pursuing figure with huge wings flapped heavily as it followed him with laborious flight through the darkness. End of chapter 17. The last chapter of Jimbo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimbo by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 18. Home. But it was the sound of something crashing heavily through the top branches of the elms that made the boy realize he was actually being followed, and all his efforts became concentrated into the desire to put as much distance as possible between himself and the horror of the empty house. He heard the noise of big wings far beneath him, and his one idea was to outdistance his pursuer and then come down again to earth and rest his wings in the branches of some tree till he could devise some plan how to find the governess. So at first he raced at full speed through the air, taking no thought of direction. When he looked down, all he could see was that something vague and shadowy, shaking out a pair of enormous wings between him and the earth, moved along with him. Its path was parallel with his own, but apparently it made no effort to rise up to his higher level. It thundered along far beneath him, and instinctively he raised his head and steered more and more upwards and away from the world. The gap at the end of his right wing, where the feathers had been torn out, seemed to make no difference in his power of flight or steering, and he went tearing through the night at a pace he had never dared to try before, and at a height he had never yet reached in any of the practice flights. He had soared higher even than he knew, and perhaps this was fortunate, for the friction of the lower atmosphere might have heated him to the point of igniting, and some watcher at one of Earth's windows might have suddenly seen a brilliant little meteor flash through the night and vanish into dust. At first the joy of escape was the only idea his mind seemed able to grasp, and he revelled in a passionate sense of freedom, and all his energies poured themselves into one concentrated effort to fly faster, faster, faster. But after a time, when the pursuer had been apparently outflown, and he realized that escape was an accomplished fact, he began to search for the governess, calling to her, rising and falling, darting in all directions, and then hovering on outstretched wings to try and catch some sound of a friendly voice. But no answer came, even from the stars that crowded in the vault above, or from the dark surface of the world below. Only silence answered his cries, and his voice was swallowed up and lost in the immensity of space almost the moment it left his lips. Presently he began to realize to what an appalling distance he had risen above the world, and with anxious eyes he tried to pierce the gaping emptiness beneath him and on all sides. But this vast sea of air had nothing to reveal. The stars shone like pinholes of gold pricked in a deep black curtain, and the moon, now rising slowly, spread a veil of silver between him and the upper regions. There was not a cloud anywhere, and the winds were all asleep. He was alone in space, yet as the swishing of his wings slackened and the roar of the air in his ears died away, he heard in the short pause the ominous beating of great wings somewhere in the depths beneath him, and he knew that the great pursuer was still on his track. The glare of the moon now made it impossible to distinguish anything properly, and in those huge spaces, with nothing to guide the eye, it was difficult to know exactly from what direction sound came. He was only sure of one thing, that it was far below him, and that for the present it did not seem to come much nearer. A cry for help that kept rising to his lips he suppressed, for it would only have served to guide his pursuer, and moreover a cry, a little thin despairing cry, was instantly lost in these great heavens. It was less than a drop in an ocean. On and on he flew, always pointing away from the earth, and trying hard to think where he would find safety. Would this awful creature hunt him all night long into the daylight, or would he be forced back into the empty house in sheer exhaustion? The thought gave him new impetus, and with powerful strokes he dashed onwards and upwards through the wilderness of space, in which the only pathways were the little golden tracks of the starbeams. The governess would turn up somewhere. He was positive of that. She had never failed him yet. So, alone and breathless, he pursued his flight, and the higher he went, the more the tremendous vault opened up into the inconceivable and untold distances. His speed kept increasing. He thought he had never found flying so easy before, and the thunder of the following wings that held persistently on his track made it dangerous for him to slacken up for more than a minute here and there. The earth became a dark blot beneath him, while the moon, rising higher and higher, grew weirdly bright and close. How black the sky was, how piercing the points of starlight, how stimulating the strong new odours of these lofty regions. He realized with a thrill of genuine awe that he had flown over the very edge of the world, and the moment the thought entered his mind it was flung back at him by a voice that seemed close to his ear one moment, and the next was miles away in the space overhead. Light thoughts, born of the stars and the moon and of his great speed, danced before his mind in fanciful array. Once he laughed aloud at them, but once only. The sound of his voice fell unpleasantly dead in these echoless spaces, and made him afraid. The speed, too, affected his vision, for at one moment the thin cloud stretched across his face, and the next he was whirling through perfectly clear air again, with no vestige of a cloud in sight. The same reason doubtless explained the sudden presence of sheets of light in the air that reflected the moonlight like particles of glittering ice, and then suddenly disappeared again. The terrific speed would explain a good many things, but certainly it was curious how creatures formed out of the hollow darkness like foam before a steamer's bows, and moved noiselessly away on either side to join the army of dim life that crowded everywhere and watched his passage. For in front and on both sides there gathered a vast assembly of silent forms, more than shadows, less than bodily shapes, that opened up a pathway as he rushed through them, and then immediately closed up their ranks again when he had passed. The air seemed packed with living creatures. Space was filled with them. They surrounded him on all sides, yet his passage through them was like the passage of a hand through smoke. It was easy to make a pathway, but the pathway left no trace behind it. The smoke rushed in and filled the void. He could never see these things properly, face to face. They always kept just out of the line of vision, like shadows that follow a lonely walker in a wood, and vanish the moment he turns to look at them over his shoulder. But ever by his side, with a steady, effortless motion, he knew they kept up with him, strange inhabitants of the airless heights, immense and misty-winged, with veiled, flaming eyes and silent feathers. He was not afraid of them, for they were neither friendly nor hostile. They were simply the beings of another world, alien and unknown. But what puzzled him more was that the light and the darkness seemed separate things, each distinctly visible. After each stroke of his wings he saw the darkness shift downwards past him through the air like a veil. It floated all round him in thinnest diaphanous texture, visible not because the moonlight made it so, but because in its inmost soul it was itself luminous. It rose and fell in eddies, swirling wreaths and undulations. Inwoven with starbeams, as with golden thread, it clothed him about in circles of some magical primordial substance. Even the stars, looking down upon him from terrifying heights, seemed now draped, now undraped, as if by the sweeping of enormous wings that stirred these sheets of visible darkness into a vast system of circulation through the heavens. Everything in these oceans of upper space apparently made use of wings, or the idea of wings. Perhaps even the great earth itself, rolling from star to star, was moved by the power of gigantic, invisible wings. Jimbo realized he had entered a forbidden region. He began to feel afraid. But the only possible expression of his fear, and its only possible relief, lay in his own wings, and he used them with redoubled energy. He dashed forward so fast that his face began to burn, and he kept turning his head in every direction for a sign of the governess, or for some indication of where he could escape to. In the pauses of the wild flight he heard the thunder of the following wings below. They were still on his trail, and it seemed that they were gaining on him. He took a new angle, realizing that his only chance was to fly high, and the new course took him perpendicularly away from the earth and straight towards the moon. Later, when he had outdistanced the other creature, he would drop down again to safer levels. A measured distance was steadily kept up between them. as though with calculated purpose. Curious distant voices shouted from time to time all manner of sentences and rhymes in his ears, but he could neither understand nor remember them. More and more the awful stillness of the vast regions that lie between the world and the moon appalled him. Then, suddenly, a new sound reached him that at first he could not in the least understand. It reached him, however, not through the ears, but by a steadily trembling of the whole surface of his body. It set him in vibration all over, and for some time he had no idea what it meant. The trembling ran deeper and deeper into his body, till at last a single, powerful, regular vibration took complete possession of his whole being, and he felt as though he was being wrapped round and absorbed by this vast and gigantic sound. He had always thought that the voice of fright, like the roar of a river, was the loudest and deepest sound he had ever heard. Even that set his soul a-trembling. But this new, tremendous, rolling ocean of a voice came not that way, and could not be compared to it. The voice of the other was a mere tinkling of the ear compared to this awful crashing of seas and mountains and falling worlds. It must break him to pieces, he felt. Suddenly he knew what it was, and for a second his wings failed him. The fact was he had reached such a height that he could hear the roar of the world as it thundered along its journey through space. That was the meaning of this voice of majesty that had set him all a-trembling. And before long he would probably hear too the voices of the planets and the singing of the great moon. The governess had warned him about this. At the first sound of these awful voices she told him to turn instantly and drop back to the earth as fast as ever he could drop. Jimbo turned instinctively and began to fall, but before he had dropped half a mile he met once again the ascending sound of the wings that had followed him from the empty house. It was no good flying straight into destruction. He summoned all his courage and turned once more towards the stars. Anything was better than being caught and held forever by fright, and with a wild cry for help that fell dead in the empty spaces, he renewed his unending flight towards the stars. But meanwhile the pursuer had distinctly gained. Appalled by the thunder of the stars' voices above, yet too frightened by the prospect of immediate capture if he turned back, Jimbo flew blindly on towards the moon, regardless of consequences, and below him the pursuer came closer and closer. The strokes of its wings were no longer mere distant thuds that he heard when he paused in his own flight to listen. They were the audible swishing of feathers. It was near enough for that. Jimbo could never properly see what was following him. A shadow between him and the earth was all he could distinguish, but in the centre of that shadow there seemed to burn two glowing eyes. Two brilliant lights flashed whenever he looked down, like the lamps of a revolving lighthouse. But other things he saw too when he looked down, and once the earth rose close to his face, so that he could have touched it with his hands. The same instant it dropped away again with a rush of whirlwinds, and became a distant shadow miles and miles below him. But before it went, it had time to see the empty house standing within its gloomy yard, and the horror of it gave him fresh impetus. Another time, when the world raced up close to his eyes, he saw a scene of a different kind that stirred a passionately deep yearning within him. A house overgrown with ivy, and standing among trees and gardens, with laburnums and lilacs flowering on smooth green lawns, and a clean gravel drive leading down to a big pair of iron gates. Oh, it all seemed so familiar. Perhaps in another minute the well-known figures would have appeared and spoken to him, Already he had heard their voices behind the bushes. But just before they appeared, the earth dropped back with a roar of 1,000 winds, and Jimbo saw instead the shadow of the pursuer mounting towards him. Up he shot again with terror in his heart, and all trembling with the thunder of the great star voices above. He felt like a leaf in a hurricane, lost, dizzy, shelterless. Voices, too, now began to be heard more frequently. They dropped upon him out of the reaches of this endless void, and with them sometimes came forms that shot past him with amazing swiftness, racing into the empty beyond as though sucked into a vast vacuum. The very stars seemed to move. He became part of some much larger movement in which he was engulfed and merged. He could no longer think of himself as Jimbo. When he uttered his own name, he saw merely a mass of wind and colour, through which the great pulses of space and other planets beat tumultuously, lapping him round with the currents of a terrific motion that seemed to swallow up his own little personality entirely, while giving him something infinitely greater. But surely these small voices, shrill and trumpet-like, did not come from the stars. These deep whispers that ran round the immense vault overhead and sounded almost familiarly in his ears. "Give it him the moment he wakes. Bring the ice bag, quick. Put the hot water bottle to his feet, immediately." The voices shrieked all round him, turning suddenly into soft whispers that died away somewhere among his feathers. The soles of his feet began to glow, and he felt a gigantic hand laid upon his throat and head. Almost it seemed as if he were lying somewhere on his back, and people were bending over him, shouting and whispering. "Why hangs the moon so red?" cried a voice that was instantly drowned in a chorus of unintelligible whispering. "The black cow must be killed," whispered someone deep within the sky. "Why drips the rain so cold?" yelled one of the hideous children close behind him, and a third called with distant laughter from behind a star, "Why sings the wind so shrill?" "Quiet!" roared an appalling voice below, as if all the rivers of the world had suddenly turned loose into the sky. "Quiet!" Instantly a star that had been hovering for some time on the edge of a fantastic dance dropped down close in front of his face. It had a glaring disk with mouth and eyes. An icy hand seemed laid on his head, and the star rushed back into its place in the sky, leaving a trail of red flame behind it. A little voice seemed to go with it, growing fainter and fainter in the distance. "We dance with phantoms and with shadows play." But regardless of everything, Jimbo flew onwards and upwards. Terrified and helpless though he was, his thoughts turned without ceasing to the governess, and he felt sure that she would yet turn up in time to save him from being caught by fright that pursued, or lost among the fearful spaces that lay beyond the stars. For a long time, however, his wings had been growing more and more tired, and the prospect of being destroyed by sheer exhaustion now presented itself to the boy vaguely as a possible alternative, vaguely only because he was no longer able to think, properly speaking, and things came to him more by a way of dull feeling than anything else. It was all the more with something of a positive shock, therefore, that he realized the change. For a change had come. He was now suddenly conscious of an influx of new power, greater than anything he had ever known before in any of his flights. His wings now suddenly worked as if by magic. Never had the motion been so easy, and it became every minute easier and easier. He simply flashed along without apparent effort. An immense driving power had entered into him. he realized that he could fly forever without getting tired. His pace increased tenfold, increased alarmingly. The possibility of exhaustion vanished utterly. Jimbo knew now that something was wrong. This new driving power was something wholly outside himself. His wings were working far too easily. Then suddenly he understood. His wings were not working at all. He was not being driven forward from behind. He was being drawn forward by the moon. He saw it all in a flash. Miss Lake's warning long ago about the danger of flying too high. The last song of the frightened children. Dare you fly alone through the shadows that wave, when the course is unknown and there's no one to save. The strange words sung to him about the restless misty moon, and the object of the dreadful pursuer in steadily forcing him upwards and away from the earth. It all flashed across his poor little dazed mind. He understood at last. He had soared too high and had entered the sphere of the moon's attraction. "The moon is too strong, and there's death in the stars," a voice bellowed below him like the roar of a falling mountain shaking the sky. The child flew screaming on. There was nothing else he could do, but hardly had the roar died away when another voice was heard, a tender voice, a whispering, sympathetic voice, though from what part of the sky it came he could not tell. "Arrange the pillows for his little head." But below him the wings of the pursuer were mounting closer and closer. He could almost feel the mighty wind from their feathers, and hear the rush of the great body between them. It was impossible to slacken his speed, even had he wished. No strength on earth could have resisted that terrible power drawing upwards towards the moon. Instinctively, however, he realized that he would rather have gone forwards than backwards. He never could have faced capture by that dreadful creature behind. All the efforts of the past weeks to escape from Fright, the owner of the empty house, now acted upon him with a cumulative effect and added to the suction of the moon life. He shot forward at a pace that increased with every second. At the back of his mind, too, lay some kind of faint perception that the governess would, after all, be there to help him. She had always turned up before when he was in danger, and she would not fail him now. But this was a mere ghost of a thought that brought little comfort, and merely added its quota of force to the speed that whipped him on, ever faster, into the huge white moon world in front. For this, then, he had escaped from the horror of the empty house, to be sucked up into the moon, the restless misty moon, to be drawn into its cruel silver web and destroyed. The song to the misty moon outside the window came back in snatches and added to his terror, only it seemed now weeks ago since he had heard it. Something of its real meaning, too, filtered down into his heart, and he trembled anew to think that the moon could be a great, vast, moving being, alive and with a purpose. But why, oh why, did they keep shouting these horrid snatches of the song through the sky? Trapped! Trapped! The word haunted him through the night. Thy songs are nightly driven from sky to sky, eternally, o'er the old grey hills of heaven. Caught! Caught at last! The moon's prisoner, a captive in her airless caves, alone on her dead white plains, searching for ever in vain for the governess, wandering alone and terrified by the awful grace of thy weird white face. The thought crazed him, and he struggled like a bird caught in a net, but he might as well have struggled to push the worlds out of their courses. The power against him was the power of the universe, in which he was nothing but a little lost whirling atom. It was all of no avail, and the moon did not even smile at his feeble efforts. He was too light to revolve around her, too impalpable to create his own orbit. He had not even the consistency of a comet, and had now reached the point of stagnation, as it were, the dead level, the neutral zone, where the attractions of the earth and the moon meet and counterbalance one another, where bodies have no weight and existence no meaning. Now the moon was close upon him. He could see nothing. There lay the vast shining sea of light in front of him. Behind, the roar of the following creature grew fainter and fainter as he outdistanced it in the awful swiftness of the huge drop down upon the moon mountains. Already he was close enough to its surface to hear nothing of its great singing but a deep, confused murmur, and as the distance increased, he realized that the change in his own condition increased. He felt as if he were flying off into a million tiny particles, breaking up under the effects of the deadly speed and the action of the new moon forces. Immense, invisible arms, half silver and half shadow, grew out of the white disk and drew him downwards upon her surface. He was being merged into the life of the moon. There was a pause. For a moment his wings stopped dead. Their vain fluttering was all but over. Hark! Was that a voice borne on the wings of some lost wind? Why should his heart beat so tumultuously all at once? He turned and stared into the ocean of black air overhead till it turned him dizzy. A violent trembling ran through his tired being from head to foot. He had heard a voice that he knew and loved, a voice of help and deliverance. It rang in shrill syllables up the empty spaces, and it touched new centres of force within him that touched his last store of courage and strength. "Jimbo, hold on," it cried, like a faint, thin, prickling current of sound, almost unable to reach him through the seas of distance. "I'm coming. Hold on a little longer." It was the governess. She was true to the end. Jimbo felt his heart swell within him. She was mounting behind him with incredible swiftness. The sound of his own name in these terrible regions recalled to him some degree of concentration, and he strove hard to fight against the drawing power that was seeking his destruction. He struggled frantically with his wings, but between him and the governess there was still the power of fright to be overcome, the very power she had long ago invoked. It was following him still, preventing his turning back, and driving him ever forward to his death. Again the voice sounded in the night, and this time it was closer. He could not quite distinguish the words. They buzzed oddly in his ears. Other voices mingled with them. The hideous children began to shriek somewhere underneath him. Wings with eyes among their burning feathers flashed past him. His own wings folded close over his little body, drooping like dead things. His eyes closed, and he turned on his side. A huge face that was one half the governess and the other half the head gardener at home struck itself close against his own, and blew upon his eyelids till he opened them. Already he was falling, sinking, tumbling headlong through a space that offered no resistance. "Jimbo!" shrieked a voice that instantly died away into a wail behind him. He opened his eyes once more, for it was that loved voice again, but the glare from the moon so dazzled him that he could only fancy he saw the figure of the governess, not 100 feet away, struggling and floundering in the clutch of a black creature that beat the air with enormous wings all round her.
He saw her hair streaming out into the night, and one wing seemed to hang broken and useless at her side. He was turning over and over like a piece of wood in the waves of the sea, and the governess, caught by fright, the monster of her own creation, drifted away from his consciousness as a dream melts away in the light of the morning. From the gleaming mountains and treeless plains below, Jimbo thought there rose a hollow roar, like the mocking laughter of an immense multitude of people shaking with mirth. The moon had got him at last, and her laughter ran through the heaven like a wave. Revolving upon his own little axis so swiftly that he neither saw nor heard anything more, Jimbo dropped straight down upon the great satellite. The light of the moon flamed up into his eyes and dazzled him. But what in the world was this? How could the moon dwindle so suddenly to the size of a mere lamp flame? How could the whole expanse of the heavens shrink in an instant to the limits of a little cramped room? In a single second, before he had time to realize that he felt surprise, the entire memory of his recent experiences vanished from his mind. The past became an utter blank. Like a wreath of smoke, everything melted away as if it had never been at all. The functions of the brain resumed their normal course. The delirium of the past few hours was over. Jimbo was lying at home on his bed in the night nursery, and his mother was bending over him. At the foot of the bed stood the doctor in black. The nurse held a lamp, only half shaded by her hand as she approached the bedside. This lamp was the moon of his delirium, only he had quite forgotten now that there had ever been any moon at all. The little thermometer, thrust into his teeth among the stars, was still in his mouth. A hot water bottle made his feet glow and burn, and from the walls of the sick-room came, as if it were the echo of recently uttered sentences, "Take his temperature, give him the medicine the moment he awakes, put the hot water bottle to his feet, fetch the ice bag, quick!" "Where am I, mother?" he asked in a whisper. "You're in bed, darling, and must keep quite quiet. You'll soon be all right again. It was the old black cow that tossed you. The gardener found you by the swinging gate and carried you in. You've been unconscious. How long have I been Jimbo could not manage the whole word. "About 3 hours, darling." Then he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, and when he woke long after, it was early morning, and there was no one in the room but the old family nurse, who sat watching beside the bed. Some dim memory that had stirred his brain in sleep immediately rushed to his lips in the form of an inconsequent question, but before he could even frame the sentence, the thought that prompted it had slipped back into the deeper consciousness he had just left behind with the trance of deep sleep. But the old nurse, watching every movement, waiting upon the child's very breath, had caught the question, and she answered soothingly in a whisper. "Oh, Miss Lake died a few days after she left here," she said in a very low voice. "But don't think about her any more, dearie. She'll never frighten children again with her silly stories." "Died?" Jimbo sat up in bed and stared into the shadows behind her, as though his eyes saw something she could not see. But his voice seemed almost to belong to someone else. "She was really dead all the time then," he said below his breath. Then the child fell back without another word, and dropped off to sleep, which was the first step to final recovery. End of chapter 18, and end of Jimbo, a Fantasy, by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Adrian Praetzellis in Santa Rosa, California, December 3rd, 2008. Happy birthday, Diana.